And our next speaker is Frank Hytten, and Frank has a background in community development, work, politics and sociology. He holds a Diploma of Youth Work, a Bachelor of Arts with majors in politics and sociology, a Master of Social Science in policy and management, and a Master in training and development. And he's currently studying at RMIT in Melbourne for his Doctor of Philosophy, focusing on the processes related to closing the gap in the Northern Territory. Frank started his working life as a youth worker in community development in the early 70s and has continued in the social and community services sector. His work has been primarily in the youth and psychiatric disability support services sectors, with people confronted by the issues that arise from poverty and exclusion, including homelessness, alcohol and other drugs, and the law. Thank you and welcome, Frank.
Well, good morning, and thanks for having me. As was said, basically, I have a background for the last number of decades in the social justice and human rights kind of space. So that's where my presentation, that's where my work comes from. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Aboriginal people, traditional people of this land, the Gadigal clans and the Eora nations. One of the things that strikes me about inclusion and exclusion, for example, is that Aboriginal people have been around for about 60,000 years on their land, and yet they are excluded from this society that now is here. That's a curious juxtaposition, I think. The other thing about the length of stays that Aboriginal people lived through the last ice age, when all of this was covered in snow. And that staggers me, that we have a day like this out there. It would have been ice out there, not water, and snow on everything. And yet Aboriginal people survived all of that. One of the key things for me is that as recently as 240 years ago, somebody else started to come here, including my family. I'm from India, so I wasn't born here. And even more recently, and I could bring you right up to today, but that's a bit too depressing, but I have members of my board and members on staff who grew up in tin sheds with earth floors. My chairperson, her mother went to enrol her in what was then the secondary school, when she was about 8 years of age, was told that the school doesn't accept Aboriginal students. So the ultimate in exclusion. We're not talking about hundreds of years or even decades, we're talking less than 40 years ago. So that exclusion is with us today, as I'm sure there's many children feel exclusion for all kinds of reasons today. So in one sense our society has come a long way, in another sense we are still as primitive as humans ever were, because we make our way through our lives by differentiating our tribe from your tribe. And if we're the more powerful tribe, then the weaker tribe gets the hell kicked out of them. And that's fundamental, I think. I don't think there's anybody in this room who wouldn't know what exclusion feels like or what it is theoretically. What we can't seem to do is find a way to change it. And that's the problem, I think. Inclusion in relation to Aboriginal people, or in fact anybody, any of the groups represented here, is not about being nice to them. It's about something far more important than being nice, or about having ritualistic acknowledgements, like the one I just gave perhaps, or flying flags, or doing any of those things. All of those things are symbols, perhaps, of how we wish to acknowledge or show respect. In themselves, unless your heart follows that ritual, it's as pointless as an 8-year-old saying grace. And I don't know about you guys, but I went to boarding school and we had to say prayers 10 times a day. And none of us really knew what the hell we were saying. We just kind of, let's eat. So I think that's an important thing in this context of trying to be respectful and trying to actually work with people who are different in some ways to us. Not in all ways, because the vast majority of our being is the same as. It's small bits that are different that we find our tribe to pick on your tribe. or my tribe metaphorically. So I think the first thing, and I've got 4 points I guess, the first thing is about understanding. We need to actually go back and understand what has happened on this land. It doesn't matter, and Aboriginal people tell me regularly that they're not into shame and blame, they're into people understanding what has happened and what that impact has been on their lives, their culture, their history, their families, their parents. The destruction that was done in the first 150, no more than that even, until about the late 1960s. This is after my family migrated to this country. My family migrated here before Aboriginal people were even people. Aboriginal people were flora and fauna until 1967, officially. So this is a very recent thing that we now actually want to include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The complexity of the destruction is really important to understand because that tells you what's been lost. People were not allowed to speak language, and as all of us are here using language today, that's how we communicate. That was what gives our families and our histories meaning. Did you wave that thing at me? You did, terrific. Sorry, I only half saw it. Okay. So that understanding that destruction is really important. And I would like to make the point for you to consider that colonisation is continuing today. If you look at the Indigenous Advancement Strategy brought down by the federal government less than 12 months ago, that is colonisation continuing. And the whole Aboriginal world was disrupted. And everything was turned on its head. And something like 60% of the funding that came out of the IAS went to non-Aboriginal organisations, perhaps many of yours. Why isn't it going to Aboriginal people to run their own affairs, is the question. The second point, and I'm going to have to rush now because I've taken too long on the first point, is to acknowledge that the facts, you don't have to believe or the implications of them, but at least acknowledge the facts of what has happened. The murders, the rapes, the movement of people, the destruction of families, the destruction of culture, the stealing of land and everything else. Land is medical, land is educational, land, everything comes from the land as it does for us. Aboriginal people used it differently, but it's the same meaning to us. We buy a house and that's our big investment in our life. It would be like me coming and simply taking your land off you, your house off you, and chucking you in the street and using it for my purpose. No different. The meaning of that cuts incredibly deep into Aboriginal people's lives. We need to accept Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice as the tellers of truth, not as some sort of excuse, people making excuses and people bludging and people blaming everybody else. The things that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people talk about are real, and that needs to be acknowledged as the truth, not as, oh, here they go again. And we need to affirm that their voice is heard and valued and respected, to use that word again. I worry about words that get used a lot because they very quickly become rhetoric and they very quickly lose meaning because they become rhetoric. That's not to the blame of the people who use it, but it's the blame of the people like me who hear it constantly. We must respect Aboriginal people. Then I see that people are not being respected. It becomes very hard to actually trust those sorts of words when they're repeated and repeated and repeated and not actually practiced. And we need to have a commitment, affirm that our non-Aboriginal people's commitment is to work with the First Peoples on their terms, not our terms. Mostly when we're asked to come in or when we volunteer to help, we go in on our terms. And we say, look, if you rearrange your whole life to suit me, everything will be okay. And that, how many more times are we going to do that before we realise that it's not true? Thank you. So I think that that's the hardest, the biggest hurdle for us in the, dare I say it, helping professions. I don't know how you guys define yourselves, but it's commonly known as the helping professions. The hardest thing is to understand is that people don't want to help. Thank you very much. They may need support to do things, but they want to do it their way. They do not want us to tell them how to do things. Whether they're Aboriginal, even people with disabilities, I often equate the way this system works for Aboriginal people as me as a man going in to assist women-run self-help groups. And this room has got dozens of women compared to about a dozen men, I think. It would be an interesting exercise to offer my help to you, to how to run your affairs and how to be real women. It wouldn't go down too well, I assume. And yet that's what we're doing daily in terms of Aboriginal people. We've put ourselves as the experts in their lives. And if they do things our way, dance to our tune, somehow we think it'll be okay. After 240 years, we haven't learned that it isn't. I think the broader frame for me is that I come to this profession and this work as a human being concerned about injustice. Because one of the complications for me is that I'm not Aboriginal, yet I head up an Aboriginal organisation. And that's a constant tension for many Aboriginal people, many non-Aboriginal people, certainly government who have to tick a box saying they've talked to a blackfella, don't want to particularly talk to me, they want to talk to an Aboriginal person because that somehow gives them authenticity. They don't listen, by the way, they don't take any notice, but they do want that. Whether we are bureaucrats, client-centred workers, teachers, whatever we are, we need to understand that what we're about in a broader frame is about justice, and it's not about telling people what to do. Our job is to listen to what people have to say and support them in doing it. There is a thing on the SNAICC website. It's called So What Can I Do? Or So What Do They Want? It looks something like that on one side, which is just a list of things, and a bunch of ways that we can actually start doing it. I didn't bring it because I didn't think I'd have time. This is a whole workshop in itself. But it is available. It's pretty self-explanatory. And if people want SNAICC to do some work with you, you're welcome to ask anyway. There's not many offers, but we're happy to do whatever we can do in terms of trying to challenge that value base. And I think every one of the speakers can work with anybody here, and you can work with us, no doubt. I know very little about some of the issues you're talking about. To try to further the cause where particularly children, and there's a number of people who have said, that's the most important aspect of our entire lives, is those first half a dozen years. Kerry Arabina from the Luija Institute, I can't even spell it for you, I'm afraid, but just have a go at Luija, it's got a J in there somewhere. They're running a program called the First 1,000 Days, which is from conception through to about the age of 2 or 3, give or take. And that's the level of importance. I think that first 1,000 days is critical, and all of you work in that space, I'm guessing. So thank you, anyhow.